Currently 5:55. We're going to be starting up in about 5 minutes. Okay, here come the people that log in at 6 o'clock. Okay, it is 6 o'clock. Might as well get started. As we, everyone gets logged in and settled and whatever, I guess I'll ask you if there are any tech issues happening right now, anything that isn't working quite right. I did get a few emails this week that some people were having problems with the recording link. Did anyone that's here right now have problems with that?
I didn't get it full screen, but that was it.
Yeah, but you actually got the recording though?
Yeah.
Yeah, it worked. Okay, that's good. I think it might have been maybe an issue with accessing it from a phone. Of course, I blame a lot of things on that. Yeah, anyway though. So this is our last actual full lecture that we're going to be doing. Next week, next Monday, for our session together, we are going to be doing a study review session, and then and that will be to get us ready for our final. I am currently working on the study guide for you. It's my goal to get that out.
Man, I do 80k damage with headshots, but I could not hit a single headshot on them.
Are you talking to me, Daniel? No, okay. Yeah, so it is our goal, my goal to get that study guide up to you by Wednesday. It probably will be by Tuesday, by tomorrow, I'll get that up. And I will have the test fully completed by next Monday, so I will be able to like fully prepare you for all that stuff. In terms of grades, I am behind on my grading, but it's my big job this week to get all of my grading for all of my classes complete and up to date to going into our finals period. And I think that's definitely going to happen, especially for you guys since your final is relatively soon. Now that it appears everyone's in, are there any additional questions or whatever? I don't think so. Okay. So I am having a very minor tech issue. All that will really mean for you is that I'm looking at a camera in a slightly different spot, but it's really no big deal. Basically, my secondary screen is just a smidge blurry, and there's some fine print on my PowerPoint presentation for this one. So. Okay, cool. Minor issue. Okay, just wait 1 second. This is just being ridiculous. Sorry about that. Okay, well, whatever. I'm gonna have to deal with that. Really no huge deal. More of an inconvenience for me. Let me try one thing, adjust the light. Okay, that should do the job for me. I should be fine. I have some green beans growing at a spot in my garden, and there's a light on them. I turned that light off, and now I can see my one screen totally fine. So we are good to go. This week's lecture is on colonialism. Because most of this class has been structured like an anthropology class. In a sociology class, this is when I would talk about broader social issues and social movements and sometimes social problems. So at this point for our last lecture, I decided talking about colonialism in terms of global cultures was a pretty good fit. So we're going to talk about what colonialism was / sort of still is. We'll talk about the ideology of colonialism, the tactics of colonialism, why Europeans were like the ones to do colonialism mostly. We'll talk about how colonialism existed and still exists in the United States. And then finally, we will end up with the lasting repercussions of colonialism. Some things that might be troubling in this lecture are mentions and explanations, minimal explanations of wartime rape, ideologies of white supremacy, oppressions of indigenous peoples, and state-sanctioned kidnapping. Colonialism is a really brutally ugly thing, and we are going to be dealing with some ugly things here. If any of you downloaded the slides for this, and maybe you're the kind of person that counts the number of slides, I think this lecture will be just about the same length as other lectures. These slides that I have a whole bunch of content on them, a little bit more than I actually usually do. So there's more content on the slides, but a lesser number of slides. That's just kind of how this all came out today. So here we go. First, let's talk about what exactly colonialism is. Colonialism is the active possession of a foreign territory and the maintenance of political domination over that territory. That definition, I believe I pulled directly from the book. It's technically true, but it doesn't absolutely pull in the flavor of a lot of types of colonialism. I'll get more into the detail in this in a second. That whole possession of a foreign territory bit didn't always jive with the culture of the colonial power itself. For instance, when we're going to talk a lot about the British Empire. The British Empire really is our culture of the week for this week. In the British Empire, when the 13 colonies were part of the British Empire, for most of that time, most people in the colonies felt that they were British citizens, right? They did not feel that they were being occupied by a foreign power. They felt that they were also part of Great Britain. Now, what did the Native Americans that were there also feel? That's a different story. But that is a long-winded way to say that definition is maybe not exactly perfect, like most definitions are. Colonies, then, we are going to define as territories under the immediate political control of a, that should say right there, of a foreign nation or state. And the repercussions of colonialism are still felt to this day in many places that were formerly colonized. The United States, having been colonized by Great Britain, we really don't feel the repercussions of British colonialism. However, somewhere like French Guiana, somewhere like Sierra Leone, other places that have been colonized, and we're going to talk about a lot of them today, they definitely do feel those lasting repercussions. So colonies generally produced the raw materials. That was the role of colonies in the basic colonialism relationship. And you probably, I'm assuming that what I learned in high school and elementary school is the baseline because I went to a not good high school. I'm assuming you also learned that in high school, that we were a colony of Great Britain and we provided raw materials, and then we shipped those raw materials back to Great Britain, and then they produced manufactured goods. And that would have been what you memorized for the test and maybe what you might have remembered. This relationship, though, of shipping those raw materials back to the mother country, which is the definition we'll get on the next slide, had amazing capacity for exploitation, not just exploitation of raw materials. Obviously, the system is set up to pull materials from natural settings, but exploitation of the people actually live in the colonies. Hypothetical question I put up there: what is the good of an iron mine if you don't have a steel mill? What good is timber if you don't have a sawmill or a paper factory? You could work around with iron, right? You totally could. You could work around with timber in its basic sense, but really to get the full use of those goods, you need large manufacturing capacity. And that large manufacturing capacity was typically not something that colonial powers just gave out to their colonies. It's not something that they really, they wanted the colonies to have. Because this unbalanced trade situation left, it was intentional. It left the colonies in the subservient position to the mother country. It made it so that the colonies required Great Britain to actually fully function. And as I mentioned just a second ago, the 13 American colonies, really, we were on the upper side of colonized powers. We really had a lot more leeway than a lot of other colonies did. And part of that is rooted in racism, because many of the citizens, what were considered British citizens here in the United States, we were white. So for that reason, you know, because of the racist concepts of the day, they say, well, those are people kind of like us. And there were many of them who were actually direct immigrants from the United Kingdom. So they were more trusted than, say, people who had been colonized that were non-British citizens and non-white. There are heavy, heavy racist implications throughout this entire conversation. And I will try to touch on those wherever it is appropriate. So as I mentioned this, you can't really even talk about colonialism without talking about the mother country. The example that I'll use throughout this lecture is of Great Britain. Great Britain in the span of the British Empire is the mother country. And specifically, what is interesting about Great Britain and what is interesting about most Americans' knowledge of the geography of Great Britain is that we usually call this cluster of islands, we usually just call the whole damn thing England, right? The reality of the matter is England is just this portion right here. And then over time, England, governing-wise, dominated Wales and Scotland, and then a little bit later, they dominated all of Ireland. If you're not super familiar with your geography of the British Isles, this blue part here is the independent state of Ireland. This yellow portion is Northern Ireland. That is still considered part of the United Kingdom. Ireland is not considered part of the United Kingdom. Scotland is still part of the whole shebang. A couple years ago, Scotland went through an independence referendum where it was considering breaking off from the UK, but that's a different story entirely. But even within the British Isles, we see a mother country being England, spreading to Wales, spreading to Scotland, and over to the island of Ireland. But that's, again, a long-winded way of saying that England started this colonial thing within the Isles itself, and then it spread overseas. Other colonies of Great Britain, other than the 13 American colonies, were India, Canada, Australia, Ireland, and then, of course, as I mentioned right there, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and others. It's the British Empire was simply massive. We'll see that and look at that on the next slide. What else am I missing here that I wanted to mention? Oh, so the American colonies, as you likely know, we broke away in 1776. India didn't fully break away until the 1940s. Canada didn't fully break away from the UK until the late 70s. And the way Canada broke apart was very, very, very slowly. It was over 75 years before Canada kind of started the process rolling and then went. So some countries that broke away from the British Empire, they did it really gradually. Some of them declared independence and fought a war over it. There were a number of ways that countries went from being part of the dominating colonial empire and not. And that is seen globally in all global colonial empires. I really, and it struck me as I was doing this presentation, that you could absolutely 100% do an entire course just on the nature of colonialism. Like, there are a lot of subjects within sociology and anthropology that we talk about for like a week, and you really could talk about for a whole course. This is fully one of those. So, as I mentioned, the British Empire really did span across the globe. If you know your history, you know probably the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire. That implied that the British Empire is simply massive. And actually, as the globe went around, in the biggest of the empire, in that time from 1715 to 1919, the sun never did set on the British Empire, us being a globe and all. Now, obviously, the 13 colonies, we broke away in 1776. There were some other spots that weren't part of the British Empire when we broke away. Some other spots were added, but this map does incorporate the major pieces. You can see that at one point, Great Britain claimed a piece of Antarctica right there. There were international treaties in the 20th century that said, hey, no one can really make a claim like that to Antarctica, but the British certainly did try. And you can see a huge span of those countries there. As noted, some colonies were largely self-governing, and that self-governing absolutely did correlate with race, absolutely did correlate with the cultural closeness of Great Britain with the people living there, right? Because they definitely did believe in white supremacy. They believed that British white people, they were the people who should be in charge, and thus they were the people in power in the colonies. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say on this slide. Great Britain was not the only global power during the colonial era. However, colonialism definitely was more common among European nations. So there have been empires in Asia that were dominated by Asian cultures. There have been empires in South America. The Incan Empire was one of them that, was an indigenous empire, if you will. However, when we talk about the colonial era and colonialism, we are most typically talking about a Eurocentric kind of phenomena. Other colonial powers included the French colonial empire that ranged from 1670 to 1980, right? France didn't give away the last of its colonies until the 80s. Imperial Spain, also known as the Hispanic monarchy, ranged from 1492 to 1976. Imperial Japan lasted from 1868 to 1947. You'll note 1947, the end of World War II. A lot of these shifted around either around World War I or World War II. Imperial Germany lasted from 1871 to 1919, again, immediately following World War I. And then Nazi Germany, who was trying to reclaim the power of Imperial Germany. Remember, Imperial Germany called itself the Second Reich, and then Nazi Germany called itself the Third Reich. Nazi Germany went from 1933 to 1945. thank goodness, shorter empire. The Russian Empire lasted from 1721 to 1917. Again, that's closely tied with the end of World War I. And then the Soviet Union lasted from 1922 to the beginning of the 1990s. I am not going to require you to memorize that list of dates. I just wanted to give a sense of historic context there. There is on a slide coming up, there is a huge string of dates. Please, please, please don't waste your brain energy trying to memorize those dates. That's just to help you make the illustration that there have been many colonies and the eras of colonialism for each of those varied based on their point in history. So let's talk about the ideology of colonialism itself. This is the portion that I would call the culture of the week, actual portion of this lecture that I like to include in most of the lecture. So colonialism was often romanticized by ideas of bettering or civilizing the colonies, especially if the people in these colonies were non-Europeans. That definitely was an ideology that was used. You can definitely ask the question, well, were they just telling themselves that? Were the people in charge just telling that to maybe their soldiers to get their soldiers excited about the things that they were doing? Yeah, it definitely did serve a propaganda purpose. But as with many things and many ideologies, you can definitely point to people in history that probably did believe in the thing that they were doing. One part of that idea of bettering the lives were the concept of the civilizing mission. These are, or this is the idea that colonialism was a duty for Europeans and a benefit to the colonized. Here we have an image of one of the Spanish missions that is still, it's not still a Spanish mission, but these are historic buildings throughout the American Southwest that were built as part of the Spanish Empire and attempts to convert those Native American populations to Catholicism, which they did to varying extents and varying success. Such missions were typically associated with spreading Christianity. However, there were missions and civilizing missions that were also secular, that were also non-religious as well. But many, many of them, of course, were religious and do have that religious missionary connotation that absolutely goes with that kind of wording. Anything else here I want to talk about? No, and if you ever travel to the Southwest, the missions, they also extend over into California. They are absolutely beautiful. They're absolutely worth seeing. But remember, they were put there as a point of cultural domination as well. Now, what the next slide, I do want to just point out to you that it's wildly racist because it is a political cartoon from the 1940s, and that point in history, again, was dominated by white people that didn't really care about people's feelings. So, and this is a fitting, it is a fitting image to go with the concept of the white man's burden, because the white man's burden is an inherently racist concept that kept largely, it was largely a British concept, but it was also used by other European powers as an ideology to verify and ratify what they were actually doing. The white man's burden was the idea that it was the job of white people to bring civilization to non-white societies and to bring it to them whether they liked it or not. And this image really does kind of encapsulate and incorporate those ideas of these ungrateful people from, and some of them you can see the names written on there, and with these various caricatures of racist stereotypes. Cuba, we see there, India, there are other names on there, as China, I see right there too. And then that the United States, and this image is that of Great Britain, were carrying these ungrateful natives, they likely would have used the word savages, over the horrors of poverty and slavery and vice, and I think that says cannibalism. Really, really very derogatory kind of messaging that these ungrateful people, these ungrateful not white people, we do everything for them and they do nothing in return and they hate us because of it. This image, the way I interpret it anyway, from thinking about who was drawing it, this image probably was against the concept of colonialism and continuing to help non-white people, but it certainly was not in the favor of non-white people. The way I interpret this is that they're saying that Great Britain and the United States is really wasting their time, and these people should just kind of be toppled out of the basket, and we, the UK and Great Britain, shouldn't bother wasting our time with them anymore. That's kind of what I see in this. Again, just horrendous racism in and of itself. You really do see some of that when you take a naked and critical look at many elements in history. So this is the poem, The White Man's Burden. I am going to attempt to read this to you. The lettering is little. I will do my best. But really what I want to do here is analyze, and this poem, The White Man's Burden, is where we get the term, because this really set the stage for that. It was written by Rudyard Kipling in, I believe it was published in 1899. I'll just read portions of it because it is quite long. Take up the white man's burden. Oh, yeah, I can't really do it. I'll have to look at another spot because my screen is, it's much better right here. 1 second, guys. We just had our first person cut out involuntarily for the evening. So when you get cut out, please come back in. Okay, here's this really horrible poem. Take up the white man's burden, set forth ye best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. Pay attention to this while we're actually reading it. There's some really horrible things here. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child, take up the white man's burden in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple and 100 times ye made plain, to seek another's profit, to work another's gain. So we really sum up a lot of the message there in this first portion of the poem. He's saying, hey, white people, hey, British people specifically, it is your job to go to these places around the world, and we need to help these half devils and half children. So non-Europeans, they aren't going to like us. We need to go in there and make their lives better because it is our job. And they probably would have said it's our job as good Christians, because this ideology was heavily steeped also in religion and concepts of religious supremacy too. PC is not a term that would be used for any of these ideas. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end of others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hopes to naught. So you are going to go, you white people, you're going to go to these uncivilized areas of the world. You are going to help them and feed them and take away sickness, and then they're going to hate you for it, is again what they're saying. Because of course, you know, to colonize people is a fully altruistic thing, of course, which is what they would say. Obviously, I'm saying that fully sarcastically, but this is how they would view it. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. So here we're talking, you have to punch into areas that are really hard to go into. I'm going to skip to the last bit. We kind of get the idea, just fully racist propaganda garbage. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudging praise. Come now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold-edged with drear-brought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. So there is saying here that, well, they will begrudgingly say thank you in the end, and we need to push through with all of this. Rudyard Kipling, if you are not super familiar with him, which I'm assuming you're not, he really exemplified this concept that white people, that British people in particular, were doing amazing and great things in the world, and no one would ever thank them for it. He was the one that wrote the original book, The Jungle Book, that was later turned into the Disney movie. Well, the book, The Jungle Book, definitely has more of these very racist kind of ideas. He also wrote a story called Rikki Tikki Tavi, and what's that other one called? I think it's something called The White Seal or something like that. And there are very crudely drawn racist metaphors in that story as well. But yeah, that's Kipling. And Kipling really, if you want to write papers for other courses and you really want to talk about the ugliness and ideology of colonialism, Kipling is really your guy to go at. I see we have a message in the thing in the chat. One second. Wasn't he a policeman in East Asia? I am not entirely sure. I would assume that he may have done work in the military in the British Army, but I don't know if he was actually a police officer. I am going to assume that he was military soldier. You just really brought up the fact that while I grew up with a copy of the Jungle Book and the stories, I don't know much of his biography, unfortunately. It's a good question, Jason. Yeah, a little bit of backstory there that I was cornered into. I grew up with this big, thick book, the Jungle Book, and my mother would read it to me when I couldn't sleep, because as soon as she started reading it to me, it was about 3 paragraphs, then I'd just fall dead asleep, because weirdly, the literature of the 1800s didn't really appeal to a little kid in the 1990s. And this ties in with another literary concept known as the ideology of the noble savage. The noble savage is a literary archetype that portrayed non-white people as being of higher virtue due to their being closer to nature. There are many, many examples of this literary archetype, the noble savage. So the savages were, by their nature of being closer to the earth, closer to the planet, closer to the natural state of being human, whatever all that junk means, they had a certain quality to them that made them better in a way, more natural, more, I guess, in modern terms, organic in a way. But they were innocent in almost a negative way too. So they were not fully morally accountable. So it was the job of the white person in these stories to educate the noble savage, to show the noble savage the way to really guide them. Notable examples of noble savages are Queequeg in Moby Dick. Queequeg throughout the story is kind of shown the way of white people, and he's shown as having really weird, stereotypical views of what it means to be civilized, what doesn't mean to be civilized. It's not super obvious in the story. If I remember correctly, Queequeg is a Pacific Islander, if I remember correctly, or he might be an African native. I don't really fully remember. It honestly doesn't matter because he doesn't actually fill any full stereotype because he's a walking, talking stereotype. Similarly with Tonto in The Lone Ranger, and we see Tonto-like characters throughout during the era of cowboy movies. Tonto was very much the sidekick to the Lone Ranger. These were not two equals riding around the West. The Lone Ranger definitely was like the dude in charge, and Tonto was the sidekick. And while I was putting this together, I was really thinking about like how utterly bizarre that literary concept is of the sidekick. Of like, you know, you're two adult people, they're probably the same age, but of course the white guy's in charge. There have been many moments of that in history, of course, but it's certainly questionable. But yeah, the big thing to be taken away from this concept of the noble savage, just to sum it up, is that it is the duty of white people. Again, I'm saying this the way they saw it, right? That this is not how I view things, but it was the duty of white people to educate the savages, to bring them into civilization, if you will. And a last thing on Moby Dick, I honestly think the way I read Moby Dick, Queequeg was right the whole time because Ahab was a madman, obviously. I mean, anyway, so the tactics of colonialism, how did they actually do it? How did they actually do it? So while the ideology of colonialism was often, you can make an argument good intended, and I had to put that in parentheses sort of because it wasn't really good intended. The tactics were absolutely fully brutal. The way to break these societies that the colonial powers wanted to bring into their fold. The book defines pillage as to strip an area of money, goods, or raw materials through threat or use of physical violence. And that sounds like more of a micro level thing, doesn't it? It sounds like something an individual may do. It sounds like a crime an individual may do. But to put it into context, pillaging was once considered to be a part of warfare. Soldiers were, during the medieval era especially, simply allowed to take whatever they wanted from a war zone or take whatever they wanted from dead soldiers. And sometimes, historically, raping women in war zones, brutalizing the population. That was considered part of what warfare was in the past. And that obviously a hideously ugly part of that warfare. Now, while less violent than sustained warfare, colonialism also has the impact of sustained pillaging on a macro level scale, on the big scale. So that's why pillaging is a term in your book, because pillaging occurs through the structures of colonialism as they continue. And I'm starting to transition into talking about colonialism in the modern day as it is, because there are still colonial structures present in our society, even if the United States, we don't usually think of ourselves as a colonial power. Sometimes, in some ways, we certainly act like it. So corvée labor was, and where it occurs, now it's considered a violation of human rights, and it absolutely is. Corvée labor is unpaid labor required by a governing authority. And it's pronounced corvée. And I looked this up on dictionary.com because I wasn't absolutely sure, because it's one of those words that's in my reading vocabulary, but not my speaking vocabulary. So I played it over and over again on the dictionary, and it said corvée, corvée, corvée. And then my 3-year-old daughter started saying, why did it say corvée? It's like she had no idea what corvée meant. Anyway, it was just a weird moment I had this afternoon. So corvée labor, and the question is asked down but lower, was it slavery? The short answer to that is kind of. It was kind of slavery. It was intermittent. It is defined by being intermittent for temporary periods of time. So you're not sold into slavery for your whole life. You are just kind of told by soldiers usually, maybe if they're nice, they send you a note, that you have to show up and you are going to be on the road crew for 6 months, for a year, for 2 weeks, until we get this damn road built, right? That sort of idea. Typically, corvée labor occurs with surrounding public works. So things like, well, we are civilizing you people now, and we are building this road for your benefit, so you have to help build the road. That sort of logic built into the colonial mindset. Corvée laborers typically get to stay in their home territory. If they were very lucky, sometimes they got to stay in their actual homes. Was it slavery? You can definitely make an argument that it was. It is definitely 100% a human rights violation as well. That's definitely something we don't encourage in the modern era. Here we have an image of the 18th Battalion of the Indian Labor Corps doing road work. This would have been, I believe, in either the late World War I or early World War II period, I'm assuming, prior to Indian independence from Great Britain, which occurred just after World War II. Yeah. Another thing I forgot to leave here. Corvée labor is a very old kind of thing. It is speculated that possibly corvée labor was what was used to build the pyramids. Exactly what kind of labor was used to build the pyramids isn't exactly fully known, but this would have also been done in medieval Europe. This would also have been done and probably used by the Incas and many civilizations. The colonial, during the colonial era, this absolutely was something that was required of colonial populations. And again, there definitely is that concept there of these uncivilized savages, we need to put them to work because they are lazy, right? Again, because the colonial powers had no real understanding of what was happening in those other parts of the world because they didn't care. But yeah, anyway, moving on from that. Monoculture. Monoculture is another tactic that was used in building colonial empires. This is the process, the choice really to build not only farms, but entire regions on one crop, right? So it's agricultural plantations specializing in large-scale production of a single crop to be sold on the market. This is where the term banana republics come from. Banana republic, you could say is, you can probably use it in the past tense. It's not really a term that's used so much anymore. It's a term for underdeveloped countries that specialize in a single crop. There were many monoculture societies in Latin America during the 19th and 20th century. Bananas were a really consistent monoculture, namely because they were pretty popular, especially in the United States. And that derogatory term was used. And you can see my adventure I took this afternoon searching for images, Banana Republic images, and I didn't necessarily land on the clothing store Banana Republic, but absolutely the term Banana Republic is where the name of that store came from. Yes, the one that's owned by the Gap. And yes, absolutely inappropriate. The original Banana Republic, I went on a real weird Google Images spiral, and the original Banana Republic stores had a real wild jungle kind of theme to it, and really pretty racist. And of course, as I mentioned, because I had to look this up too, the owners were full-on white people, and they were not doing this in a culturally sensitive way. I suppose their cultural sensitivity and their, business activity made it so that they changed what Banana Republic was all about. Why they didn't change the name, I don't know, but that's beside the point. Now, aside from that term Banana Republic and why it isn't cool, you could ask the question, so what? So what if we just want to grow only corn, or we only want to grow black beans, or we only want to grow soybeans or cotton or whatever? What would that hurt? Well, there are distinct risks to having a monoculture. First of all, monocultures can rarely feed populations. There are very, very few crops that you can grow that will actually feed and sustain a population. Some crops, things like corn, things like potatoes, you can grow them and feed people in terms of calories, but then people start to suffer from things like from scurvy, from rickets, those sorts of diseases that come from lack of proper nutrition. So really, you can't sustain a population food-wise based only on a monoculture. So that makes the colony dependent on the mother country in yet another way, right? We have to have the mother country send in food, and those mother countries, they love that stuff. It keeps the colony subservient. Monocultures are highly susceptible to disease and to famine. Irish potato famine, which again, if you know history, was a time in the 1800s. It was actually kind of a rolling period when the potato crop fully failed or largely failed in Ireland. And during that era, millions of people starved. And that's actually what pushed a large portion of the people of Irish descent, who are now the people of Irish descent, these would have been their ancestors, to the United States, was because of the potato famine, where millions of people starved to death because their calories were fully dependent on those potatoes. And then monocultures can have major environmental impacts. The Brazilian cattle trade is an example of a major environmental impact that comes from doing a plant in a place where it really shouldn't, not a plant, cows aren't plants, of course, doing a agricultural thing in a place where it shouldn't be. They cut down rainforests, they level rainforests, and then their cows come in and eat the grass that's left. But in those areas, that is not a place where cows are really meant to be sustained in a long-term way. So it just effectively leads to deforestation. So yes, sometimes the forest does recover some, but it really doesn't recover in a way that is sustainable in any way. And you can certainly make an accusation that the UN and American-driven trade deals have often forced developing nations into monoculture agricultural schemes. This was a point of major controversy in the late 1990s and early 2000s in terms of fair trade deals. What is fair trade? What is self-sufficiency? What is fair trade versus free trade? All of those kinds of conversations to be had. I didn't want to derail the overall conversation too much by getting into that kind of thing. If you really want to read into it, though, your search terms can be the WTO, the World Bank, those sort of trade, big things. Anything else I want to put here? Yeah, monocultures aren't good, is the short of it. Monocultures definitely are pretty harmful. And additionally, if you didn't grow up a country boy like I did, you might not necessarily know that you can't grow the same crop in the same spot over and over and over and over again. You will deplete the soil. And if soil gets depleted, if there's not enough nitrogen being put back in your soil, if there's not a lot of things being put back in the soil, eventually your crop will fail. So that is yet another risk of monocultures. So it really goes against a lot of farm wisdom, honestly. So another question can be asked, why the Europeans? What makes the Europeans the big bad guys of all of this? Well, this is summed up, I think, relatively well by a hypothesis known as the guns, germs, and steel hypothesis. This is attributed to a historian named Jared Diamond. Diamond explains that the reason Europeans dominated the world during the colonial era is because the era just prior to colonialism was dominated by both warfare and illness. And here are this wild list of dates I do not expect you to memorize. Well, what's the point here? This is to drive home the warfare element of it. And I'll explain each of those 3 points, guns, germs, and steel. But Europe, in the period leading up to the colonial era, was an intensely warlike place. These are just the wars that occurred in the 92-year period up to when Christopher Columbus set sail, right? And this is regardless of our actual historic interpretation of Christopher Columbus. So there were, I didn't actually count each of these. It looks like at least 75 conflicts, probably more, on this list that can classify as being wars. Some of them are called battles. Some of them only last 1 year, right? This also speaks to the fact that there were many little teeny tiny countries in Europe during this time. There were countries that were about the size, or independent entities that were about the size of Central Ohio, right? Duchies and counties and owned by counts and whatever. But the point of that, to not get into deep into the weeds of all this wild European history, is that warfare was intensely common during this era in Europe. And for that purpose, Europeans got very used to being at war, and they got good at being at war. So this time period for the Europeans was so bad that much of our modern apocalyptic imagery comes from the terrors of the European medieval era. If you know about these entities, these mythical entities known as the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, one being death, famine, pestilence, and war. These were issues that were very common and very well known by medieval Europeans. And it really, a lot of, it was a bad time, is really the short of it. Now, so I talked about guns, right? During the medieval era, just prior to the European medieval era, gunpowder was first used in China as a weapon. Now, gunpowder and guns are two very different technologies, though. The Chinese, and I believe I pulled this image from the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Chinese, their gunpowder type weapons were more arrow type weapons. They were made out of wood, they were made out of bamboo, sometimes they were made out of types of metal, but the Asian technologies of this kind typically were very much larger than European guns were. They were not reusable. You can only really use a rocket like this once. And additionally, they were kind of weird, I guess. I did a little bit of research on this during this week. Some of them, there were rockets. Some of them were things like long spears that kind of fire coming off it, kind of like a really, really, really big sparkler or flamethrower on the end of a spear would be. Now, and these items, they were probably used as means of intimidation. They weren't really used to cause mass casualties or anything like that. They were used to frighten the opponent, to startle the opponent. European weapons people, because of the steel element of this, which we'll talk about in a moment, and metallurgy technologies in Europe, they were able to take gunpowder and turn it into a weapon that they could fire through a steel tube. And that made the weapon, the killing machine, if you will, much more smaller and much, much more reusable, right? Now, given certainly early matchlock guns were not as durable as modern weaponry is, but it was certainly something that could be taken along and used to kill a whole bunch of people. So that's the guns element. The germs element. Prior to the colonial era and continued into the colonial era, disease ran rampant in Europe during that time. This included diseases like smallpox, the bubonic plague, which is also known as the Black Death, tuberculosis, and anthrax. These are all diseases that until the modern era with antibiotics and vaccines, we still didn't have under check. But many of these diseases were localized to Europe during that time. When Europeans started to go around the world, they took those diseases with them, and they took the plague rats full of bubonic plague with them, and they took blankets that they used to cover themselves with them, and then they sometimes traded with native populations, and they sometimes did that accidentally, and they sometimes did it on purpose. So widespread plagues were part of why, I'm skipping all around. One second, I need to actually follow my own slides. So germs often ran rampant in indigenous populations, in native populations, just after their initial contact with European explorers. This, it's hypothesized by historians and by anthropologists that this is what caused the massive plagues that occurred in North America that wiped out several civilizations. And it's what made much of North America, or it's thought to maybe, what made much of North America look entirely empty to Europeans. When Europeans got here, they thought, well, this is because God intended this new territory for us, and we have to spread across it as is intended and whatever. Well, the reason it was empty is because millions of people died in smallpox outbreaks after Europeans brought it. Yeah, Europeans eventually did figure out that the smallpox was killing native populations faster than it was actually killing them. And it became a practice in some colonizing powers, in particularly the Spanish were notorious for this, the Hispanic Empire, that they would give smallpox-ridden blankets to native populations in order to try to kill them. Here we have an image from Mexico in the 1500s, and it shows the effect of smallpox on the native population. So this is their documenting what would happen because of this brand new disease that was introduced into them in the early 1500s. Really, really horrible stuff. And then the last component, steel. Steel is a dramatically stronger metal than other types of metals and other types of weapons. Steel makes weapons deadlier. It makes structures larger. So it gave the Europeans, when they started spreading around with this metal that other people didn't have, it gave them a distinct advantage. Steel is made out of iron ore, coal, and lime, the rock lime, not the fruit lime. And Europe is rich in iron ore, coal, and lime. So those things are found in other places, but the Europeans had a better shot at developing it because those minerals were more common in that region. So this enabled Europeans to make deadlier guns, sharper swords, larger ships, produce masses of nails that could be used to build new structures and become colonial powers. What Diamond is suggesting here in this hypothesis is that why Europe? Why were the Europeans able to spread across the globe? It's because of the combination of these three elements that were present in Europe. And really, the big thing is to it, what Diamond is also saying is that Europeans were not inherently superior. It was just a coincidence that these three things came together in the European population. Not that Europeans were smarter, but they had the things needed to kill the most people possible. And that's why they succeeded, if you want to use succeeded for that word. Now, this is what I want to drive home here. Domination does not mean European technology was better. It means that their war technology was better. That's what it means. It gave warlike people the capacity to take over. And the star here, I don't want you to think that non-Europeans didn't have their unfair share of wars. There certainly were wars that were waged around the globe without Europeans, but the combination of those three factors coming together were what made it so that globally, white people have a distinct advantage to this day over people of color because of the power and the power structures that were built during the colonial era. Other societies definitely developed other technologies. African societies developed social concepts, which could be called social work technologies. There's one concept, there are many of these. This is the first one that came to my mind, the concept of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a concept, I believe, of the Bantu tribes. If I'm correct, I might be wrong on that. But anyway, that I am because you are. And what that one word means is that we all have to exist in community in order to make this thing work. That was not a concept that the British colonialists were really spreading around all that much. Additionally, African societies also had a very vast knowledge of astronomy and documenting where the stars were and using that for navigation, in addition, using it to tell time. Additionally, indigenous American societies developed plant technologies. And we don't think of plants as being technologies, right? But over thousands and thousands of years, the people who were already present in South America and gave us potatoes. Potatoes are not a European thing. Potatoes are part of many European cuisines, but potatoes originated in Latin America, or what would become Latin America. Corn is a technology, I believe, of North America, if I'm correct on that one. We didn't have corn in Europe. Corn was something that was in North America. And think about how much corn everyone eats now. There would be no Fritos without corn, which would be a tragedy. And then also astronomy. I had this written down. It's not the Hopewell civilization. It was a different civilization that was already present here in Ohio that built the Serpent Mound. If you don't know, Serpent Mound is a earthwork, Native American earthwork that is still in pretty close to the Athens, Hocking Hill region. It is a massive hill. It's a little mound. It's a mound. It's maybe 20 feet high at its highest, and it goes down this kind of mountain structure. This is, I can tell you because I've been there, this is the top of the hill right here, and then it goes down to the bottom of the hill, being this bit, which is sometimes interpreted as being an egg that the serpent is swallowing. And to look at it, it's not super obvious that this is a astronomical thing, but it is undeniable that if you are sitting right here at the summer solstice rise, then you'll see it head on. And then at the spring equinox, it shines right through here. Winter solstice, it shines right through here. Summer solstice, it shines right through here. Those are not coincidental. They had to have a really super sophisticated knowledge of sun going up, sun going down, cycles of the world. Additionally, Serpent Mound is really pretty fascinating in a geologic sense. There is a massive tectonic upheaval that occurred in the Serpent Mound region that makes the zone of Serpent Mound really super duper unique in terms of Ohio geography, not geography, geology, and in a way that shows that whoever built this thing here had an understanding of geology that was way beyond what Europeans at the time had. We don't know so much about, and I'm sorry I'm blanking on the name of the society that built the Serpent Mound. I just had it yesterday, but you can look it up yourself. Serpent Mound's a really fascinating thing. And you could pretty easily do a responsible socially distanced day trip there if you so desired to. It's a really cool thing. Anyway, maybe a field trip one day. So let's talk a little bit more about colonialism as it existed in the United States. And as it exists in the United States, quite frankly, we have to be honest with ourselves. It's really difficult for us as modern Americans to really come to grips with our history of colonialism and the way colonialism still exists in our country. But it is absolutely real and absolutely still a thing. While we were originally a colony of Great Britain, after we broke away from Great Britain, we maintained the tactics of colonialism in our relations with Native Americans. And that's what most of this last part is about, is our interactions with Native Americans. And this history is so important for us to remember. And we often think, oh, those super insensitive parents and kids in the 1950s with their playing cowboys and Indians, and oh, we so know better now, and that's so inappropriate. But this, I found this image of a birthday party invitation, and it's marked 2015. That was on Pinterest when I searched this afternoon. There's still people throwing cowboys and Indians parties. And I may be a little bit more sensitive to this because of my time I've spent in New Mexico and getting to know people who are, modern day Native Americans and knowing tribal cultures and those sort of things. This stuff, modern Native Americans do not think it is cool by any stretch of the imagination. And a lot of that has to do with the history of what has happened between the US government and Native Americans. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is still to this day a department within the United States government that attends to issues involving Native Americans. It was originally part of the Department of War, if I remember correctly. Well, it's right here on the seal, that's why I put it. It first came into being in 1824. Again, not as part of the Department of the Interior, but as part of the Department of War, because they were currently consider themselves to be fully at war with the Native American population. The Bureau of Indian Affairs oversaw the removal of the Cherokee and other nations in the Southeast into the Oklahoma Territory, that being known as the Trail of Tears. Anyone, especially among the tribes and anyone that really knows the history of this thing. The Trail of Tears was absolutely a very wicked and dark moment in American history. The BIA also oversaw forced assimilation of tribes into quote unquote civilized society. Most of what the BIA did during the 1800s would fully, if you really dug into it, it's really some very ugly stuff. The BIA still exists. In the modern day, it provides social services for tribes. It provides, what they consider to be helping out elements to the tribes. And the BIA to this day remains rather unpopular among the tribes. Now, given from one tribe to another, it's different attitudes, different people, of course, but many Indian populations find many people are very in touch with their history, especially older people among Native Americans, and they find these minor social services in compared to killing their ancestors to be completely unacceptable. It's a whole thing. What's his name? Sherman Alexie is a Native American author who has written a whole lot about this kind of experiential thing. His name's Sherman Alexie. One of his better books in this regard is called Tonto and the Lone Ranger Fist Fight in Heaven, I think is the name of that book. It explores a lot of these kinds of themes of resentment and historic resentment. And that's not all. The Indian schools are a very dark moment in American history. It was overseen by the Bureau of Indian Education, which was not the same institution as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but they did work very closely with each other. You can think of it kind of like maybe the FBI and I don't know, the CIA or DARPA, similar organizations, the Bureau of Indian Education intentionally separated children from their families and forced them to only speak English. This is state-sanctioned forced kidnapping that we did to Native Americans. These children did not have a choice. Their families did not have a choice. They just said, we are taking you away, these children away, because you are not being fit parents. And they did that in mass. It discouraged, once the children did become adults, and once they graduated through the whole process, they then strongly discouraged those children to go back to their tribes to help the tribes. They had the effect of encouraging Native Americans to marry white people to cause that kind of forced racial assimilation. These schools, I don't know if you can really see it in this image. You can't really super tell, but most school, maybe these are girls in the front and boys in the back. Many schools were single sex, so there were boys' schools and girls' schools. That did have the impact of making them unable to find a mate who is also a Native American, make them find someone who was like them. That definitely also had a major cultural impact as well. But it wasn't just the United States that did this. Similar institutions had been set up by other colonial powers. The Australian Aborigine schools did very, very similar practices. Now, the difference there being, it's a minor difference, but Australia now has a holiday that they call Sorry Day, where every year, I can't remember when Sorry Day is, but they set the day aside as a day of national mourning, effectively to apologize to the Aborigine population for what they did, particularly related to the Aborigine schools. We don't have something like that in the United States. There is some speculation that we could make the thing that may replace Columbus Day and some people use the term Indigenous Peoples Day. That could be a thing that we do. I really do, and in the other classes I teach, I like the idea of Sorry Day, though. I think it's straight up as to what it actually is, which, it's not a hot dog day, right? Here is an image that I find rather telling. These are Native American reservations in the United States as they currently exist. You will note that there's a couple things here. You will note that the emptier a zone is, the bigger the reservation is. So they put them in places that basically they weren't intended to be colonized anyway. You will also note that there are very few reservations to the east of the Mississippi River, right? And take a look with this map on the next slide. Note that it's mostly in the region of after the Louisiana Purchase. This whole territory was British territory. And I just find that really super telling on the history of the systematic elimination of Native American tribes. And also, there were more tribes here prior to the Trail of Tears, and those groups were mostly moved over to this zone in Oklahoma. Originally, the entire Oklahoma territory was intended to be, and on some old maps, still called Indian Territory. That is not something that actually happened with Oklahoma. Really pretty wild. It's easy to get bummed out about this stuff because it actually is something we very much should be bummed out about. Anyway, another concept. Oh, okay.
I had a quick comment I was going to make. I was just going to say that those are just the ones that are recognized by the United States as being actual tribes.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah. Anything else to add to that?
No, that's all I was going to mention about that map particularly.
Oh, for sure. Thank you for pointing that out. Those are just the ones that are recognized. There are many tribes that are unrecognized, especially smaller groups. That is for sure a really good point. Really good point. Thank you, Nessa. Oh, wait, I need this slide. Manifest destiny is another issue and really a colonialist concept that is very much present in American history. It's the idea that the United States should expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. It's super easy being people. We are all alive today, so that means we were not alive in the 1800s to forget that there was a time when the United States was just right here. And then there was a time when it was just right here. And then it was just right here, right? And that this whole portion right here was once part of Mexico. And there are many villages throughout the Southwest that were there 200 years before the United States even existed. And there are many small Spanish-speaking villages out there that were there, again, long before the United States ever existed. Manifest destiny is a concept. It's very, very, very much a colonialist concept. It's most closely associated with President James K. Polk, and it was absolutely helped out by the Mexican-American War, which is when we got this whole zone right here. And then politically, it kind of justified the acquiring of the Oregon country too. Texas annexation was kind of its own thing, but Texas was also part of that there. California was close to becoming its own country during that period. Texas was its own country for a smidge of history there. But history is so important. It really is. And also, it's interesting to point out that this little zone here was once part of the United States, then we gave it back to Great Britain in exchange for this zone right here. Oh, the what ifs of human history. And anyway, I could look at history maps all day. And then we forget about this stuff. We forget about these islands, all these little islands that we own out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and that we acquired via military conquest. Cuba, you might not know, was part of the United States for a short 4-year period. And then we could talk more about the history of Cuba and how one of the major reasons why the Castro regime continues to hate us is because the Batista regime, just before the Castro regime, were very, very close to the United States. And why one of the reasons, and that regime especially was associated with major corruption, a lot of crime, a lot of exploitation of the native people. And that's why they went full-bore communist on us, is because the previous people were real monsters too. But that's a side tangent. Anyway, we got the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and an island called Palmyra. We got that all in the Spanish-American War, which is a war that we don't really teach so much in our American history classes, and it lasted less than 1 year. We got all these little islands here, including Hawaii. Hawaii actually wasn't part of that conquest going in with the Spanish-American War. It was it was kind of a different complex thing, but that was not from Spain. We got Samoa, in U.S. Samoa. There's two different chains of islands that call themselves Samoa. We got that when we negotiated it with Germany, because they also had a colonial claim on it in 1900. And then the U.S. Virgin Islands, we actually straight up bought them from Denmark in 1917 when they were getting rid of a lot of their colonial powers. We said, hey, we'll buy that. But that does not mean that the United States is unique in this regard. There were a lot of countries that were trying to find their become colonial powers too during this time. Japan. And a lot of what led up to the World War II was because Japan was trying to be a colonial power. The difference is that historically we won out and they didn't, and that's really what a lot of it comes down to. I'm very interested historically in what the losers of history actually have to say too. I find that to be very interesting history. Unfortunately, it's said, and as we know in history, that the winners are typically the ones that write the history books. Here's a different way of viewing colonialism in the United States. This is a concept known as internal colonialism. This is using the resources from one part of a country to benefit another part of the country while failing to develop the so-called colonized region. A real good example of internal colonialism is the Appalachian region. I know some people call it Appalachian region, but I grew up in Appalachia, and I say it Appalachia, so that's how I'm going to say it. I could probably easily be corrected on that. Here's my home county of Armstrong County. You will note that we only have 75 to 100% the poverty rate of the United States. There's many areas within the Appalachian region. These white areas are the only areas really that are prospering in these zones. And then the farther south and the farther west you get into this region right here, we see really dense, really deeply entrenched poverty. And one element that is especially troubling about the Appalachian region is that this region is very, very dense in natural resources, very dense in coal, very dense in timber, very dense in a lot of the natural resources that were used to build cities like Chicago, to build cities like New York. Yes, Pittsburgh is right here, and that is a big city. But if not for internal colonialism, you would expect to see like a big New York City or at least Chicago-like city right here. There are cities in this zone, but they aren't really industrial powerhouse type cities the way that you see in other parts of the country. This backing up this claim that the Appalachian region is a type of internal colony within the United States. And another piece of data that backs this up is that the median income, you could call that an average income, in the United States in 2019 was $64,000 per household, and in Appalachia it is $49,000, almost $50,000 per household. It takes a whole lot of suffering to make that kind of income go down by that much. Now, given this is better than it used to be in Appalachia, but it is definitely still an area we can continue to improve. Actually, on an up note, this kind of systemic inequality, a lot of jobs can be gained through telecommuting and through online kind of work. So a lot of these smaller rural areas are benefiting in that regard too, but it doesn't really equal out kind of the historic issues there. So let's talk about some of the lasting repercussions of colonialism. So due to historic inequalities, I'm sorry, I think I was in a rush when I wrote this slide. What am I trying to say here? Due to historic inequalities, former colonies and former motherlands remain divided. So what am I saying here in this kind of nonsense jumble of words is that there is still a division between former motherlands and former colonies. The United States, very obviously, we do not suffer in the way of being a former colony of Great Britain, but there are some places that absolutely do. Places like Chile Chile is considered developed. I didn't know that about Chile. But Brazil is still considered developing. Argentina is still considered developing. Australia is developed. Canada is developed. China is considered developing. And I just picked the A, Bs, and the Cs because this is a very long list. But there are still continued inequalities between those countries. Now, point on nomenclature and syntax. There is a very interesting debate among scholars of international policies and international relations over what to call these things. The most common terms between these countries are developed and developing. Those are words that are pretty frequently used. And I'll talk about the history of that in a second. There are some scholars that say, well, it really, in the modern sense, doesn't really serve a purpose anymore to distinguish between the developed and the developing country. Maybe we don't need to talk about what and have words for a rich country and a poor country. Maybe we should talk about what the United States is doing versus what Mexico's doing versus what Britain's doing versus what South Africa's doing, and talk about them when we're comparing things instead of just lumping them up into big pieces. A big part of why we lump those into big pieces is, again, because of the history. And I've talked about the Cold War a number of times in this course, but it is super important to understand cultural differences in the world. During the Cold War, the third world was a term to use to refer to those poorest nations in the world. Now, you can ask, well, third world, well, where's the first world? Many people know that the first world were countries that were rich. That's sometimes a term we use. Well, we have first world countries, first world problems, right? That's a term we still sometimes use, and third world countries and third world problems. And then sometimes people ask, well, what was the second world? Well, there's the artifact that indicates we shouldn't really even be using those terms anymore, because second world countries were allied with the Soviet Union and they were therefore socialist oriented. These terms, first world and third world, are artifacts of the Cold War. They really aren't super relevant in talking about modern nations, and those developed and developing terms are pretty darn useful sometimes. But it may be that maybe in the next 10 or maybe 20 years, maybe those scholars that say maybe we shouldn't make distinctions, maybe those people are right too. Because there are some ways, and I'm sure a lot of us feel this way, especially those of us that have not the best healthcare, that the United States isn't really being a first world country all the time either anymore. And maybe those kind of grand generalizations aren't really super useful on the global scale. Anything else I want to touch on this slide? Yeah, and as I mentioned in previous courses, in previous lectures, especially when I talked about South Africa, a lot of the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, a lot of the conflict occurred in these green zones, these third world nations, and it was part of the international conflicts of the Cold War. Whoops. Oh, 1 second. I'm having this. Oh, no, I'm not. Okay. So here's a major point of inequality. And this is something that we absolutely could, it is something that needs to be discussed in terms of on the international scale. There is a reason why many countries in the developing world take resentment to the United States, and in particularly Europe, because the United States doesn't really take a lot of leadership in terms of the environment. But sometimes developing nations will take point and say, hey, listen, guys, it's not fair. You guys got to pollute as much as you wanted in the 1800s and the 1900s when you were developing, and now we should have a chance to do that kind of pollution. It's very easy for you to come up with those regulations now that you're developed and now that you're rich. Why can't we do some of this stuff too? And I mean, at a certain point though, we need to say, well, this whole damn globe is warming up and we are all going to potentially die because of the ramifications of that. But also those points, they do also mean something. And for example, China does produce a massive amount of pollution, but they are also developing in a way that we were in the early 1900s. This next image is kind of telling. 1 second. This is an image of Pittsburgh in the 1940s. There were many images of Pittsburgh during this era when in downtown Pittsburgh at noontime at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it looked like it was almost nighttime because of the fine particulates in the air. And here's an image of Beijing today. Beijing being one of the major industrial centers within China. Honestly, this image of Beijing today probably looks cleaner than a lot of the images from Pittsburgh during that era because technology for making pollution has refined. Certainly, but these arguments can certainly go both ways. And they can also go, well, we know how to prevent that kind of really horrible pollution today. But it is a point that when we are talking in international relations, and who knows, some of you may do international relations at some point in your life, that it's a point to understand. Still stand up for whatever you're doing, but it's a good thing to know. Nuclear energy. Now, my personal opinion on nuclear energy can change from month to month, week to week. It really is something I see both sides on. The United States often expresses concern when developing countries attempt to develop nuclear energy programs. A lot of that has to do with nuclear weapons, obviously. However, the United States is the only country to ever use nuclear weapons in war. That point is definitely something that gains us a lot of criticism on the international level, that we are so concerned with other people getting weapons of mass destruction, but we're the only ones to actually use specifically nuclear weapons in that regard. should nuclear weapons ever be used? Absolutely not. But we don't really have a big moral hill to stand on. Many developing nations want to develop nuclear power plants to be able to generate electricity in a more environmentally friendly way. France has a large nuclear infrastructure. I believe Germany has pretty substantial nuclear infrastructure. The arguments that are made by Iran is that they would also like to build that nuclear infrastructure. But it's not that easy to make those deals at these moments. The reason I included the picture of the stacks here is because these massive white plumes that come out of nuclear power plants are not the major environmental issue. There are certainly areas surrounding nuclear power plants that are hyper problematic for the environment. But all of the smoke that comes out of these massive stacks, that's not really the dangerous part. Now, where nuclear power plants do become problematic is that if they are not run in an environmentally sustainable way, it is tempting, and this has happened in the past, but modern plants claim they don't do this, to release water that is hundreds of degrees hot immediately into waterways, into rivers and streams right here. So that, and if you do that, you kill all the fish, you kill all the life in those streams. And then also nuclear power plants do eventually, over a longer period of time, produce nuclear waste. And that nuclear waste is highly problematic. And what exactly do you do with it? Do you shoot it off into space? Do you bury it deep underground? That burying it deep underground is a solution that has been used, but then you eventually run up against, well, our areas deep underground are entirely filled up. Like I said, I have very mixed feelings about nuclear power. Anything to add to that? Any questions or whatever?
I was going to say, isn't there also the concern that there would be something like what happened with Chernobyl?
Absolutely. Oh, full bore. Absolutely. If you want to look into things that have happened in the United States, 3 Mile Island was a major nuclear catastrophe that did occur in the United States around nuclear poisoning. And I don't know if I've mentioned this. I don't think I have. And this is part of the reason why I really have very mixed feelings about nuclear power. My hometown and the town next to my hometown is absolutely riddled with cancer today because of unsafe nuclear practices that were used in a plant that was in between my hometown and the next town over. And a whole lot of people developed very bad cancer in the 1990s because of bad practices that they did in the 1970s. But again, nuclear power has the capacity to take us off of these very damaging fossil fuels too. But I mean, it's as much as how much do you trust your leadership, right? Like if we could be in a position where we really trust our leadership and the people in charge of our society, then I would fully trust nuclear power. But yeah, the world is rough. Absolutely. Fully agree with you there. Anything else to add on this, to this weird screed about nuclear power I added to the end of a weird screed on colonialism? No? Okay, you've trained yourselves. You all see that my 30 at the end of this means that I'm done with the whole thing. Wait, what's happening here? Hey, 1 second, guys. Yeah, that is the end of the presentation. I thought I might have had a whole lot more slides. So that's it for this evening as far as content goes. Let's go look over at the actual assignments that we have. So, and let me share with you. Okay, do you guys see my Blackboard right now?
Yes.
Great, thank you. We have a two-part assignment this week. I would very strongly suggest you watch what you do, or at least do your initial post on the discussion before moving into the essay, because the discussion is kind of laying the groundwork for the essay. So I want you to go on to this very good resource. It's actually provided by the CIA. I don't know how much you've worked with the CIA World Factbook, but the CIA World Factbook is kind of a PR resource that the CIA has developed to actually help citizens of the world in terms of geographic literacy. So you click here on the CIA World Factbook. Let's just make sure the link is working well today. Yes, it is. And you can find nations all over the world and get a cool little one-page, well, let's see how. So you have a great one-page breakdown of Azerbaijan right here, and you can learn all about Azerbaijan. And then there are other resources that give you longer, little bit more information there. But the CIA World Factbook is a good starting point in terms of learning about a new country. Now, what you're going to do is that you are going to pick a country and in either South America and Africa. And I point out South America and Africa because those two continents were especially heavily abused during the colonial era. So I want you to pick a country. I want you to talk about who colonized this country or people, or if it was never colonized, who tried to colonize it, when did it gain its independence, what specific consequence did the country face during colonialism? So how was it hard, right? How were things hard during colonialism? How were things hard after colonialism? And are there any modern repercussions faced by that country today? Now, this is only this is a relatively short post. It's just like all of our other discussions. I just want you to sum this stuff up and share with other people, and then do the comment thing like you do on your standard discussions. And then in the short paper, I want you to stick with that same country, right? I don't want you to have to do all the research in the world. I just want you to stick with that country. You probably, in writing your paper, do want to go off on another source other than the World Factbook. For this assignment, you are required at least 3 total references. Up to 5 may be a good idea just for your own, to make it easier for you, but you need to have at least 3 total references, at least 2 citations per page. So for the actual writing of the short essay, imagine you're part of the descended population from the colonizer of this country. So for example, if you're in India, you would be a white person whose ancestors were British. How might things be for you in this place if you were born now? So what would it be like if you were a British person, a person of British descent who was born in India today? Now, imagine you're part of the colonized local culture that were deeply affected by colonial rule. How might things be for you in the said place as this person if you were born there now? So in the case of India, what would it be like for you if you were someone in India who was descendant of people who were from India, right? Compare and contrast that a little bit. I just want us to do a little bit of cultural exploration there. Again, this is 500 to 750 words. Use the sources as you see fit. It's largely a kind of cultural exploration piece, really. We'll see how it goes there. Does that all make sense for everyone? Do we understand what we're doing there? Okay, the way I interpret the silence from, yes, thank you so much for those thumbs ups. I appreciate that. Any other issues before we go on our way for the week? Okay, we have made it through the lectures, and then next week I strongly suggest, like I did with the midterm, that you look over and you review the study guide. The study guide for next week will not be due until the midterm period, and I'll have that information fully sussed out for next week. But I do suggest that you look over the study guide, you define those definitions, you work them over so that when we have our time together next week, which is at our normal class time, you can ask me questions that make sense with, you know, your lack of knowledge or whatever there. Okay, I am going to call it there for the evening, and let me know if you need anything. See ya.